All right, I think we have enough to get started. We're about 4 minutes past the hour, and we have lots of fun things to get covered. So I'm just going to start to share my screen. And while we're sharing our screen, you do not need to have your video on. We do love to see your faces. It's much easier to present and to share when we're seeing reactions from participants, but you don't have to have it on. And there are a couple of breakout opportunities where you're going to be shared and kind of paired into a breakout Zoom room with someone. And so I do ask that you're prepared to potentially go on video, like I was telling to Stephen, to talk with that other individual so that they see a face on the other line. But with that, I'm actually going to send this over to Stephanie.
Great. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Steph Braid. I'm the Director of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity with KPMG in Canada, and I'm so excited to be here today with all of you. It was so great seeing everyone in the chat where you're from. Love that we have representation from across the country. Feel free to keep putting in the chat where you're from. Just love seeing everyone's intros. I'm joining you all today from Kitchener, Ontario, my home office here, which I humbly recognize is located on the traditional territories of the Neutral, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. You know, for all of us who came today to our session that we're hosting on human-centered design, as well as the Catalyst Honors Conference in general, I know we're all here for a purpose. And that purpose is we all have this goal to really identify new ways that we can all make an impact to create a more inclusive and equitable workplace and world for all women and for all people. And so, you know, I'm really excited about the potential of today and tomorrow's sessions with Bridgeable because I think it's really going to offer all of us some new practical tools and strategies about how we can actually go about creating this change. And that's through harnessing the power of human-centered design thinking, and really putting the voice of people and the people that we are ultimately trying to serve, you know, at the heart of everything that we do, which is so important. And that's really why KPMG and myself were so thrilled to partner with Bridgeable and Catalyst on this session and be a part of it, because we know that to create really meaningful change in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, it's not going to happen in a silo or in an ivory tower, if you will, somewhere. It really, to get to the true change that we're all trying to seek, it has to be the product of immersing ourselves in the lived experiences, the perspectives, the realities of the people that we're trying to serve, and really working and partnering shoulder to shoulder with them to find new innovative solutions. And, you know, I think realizing, you know, the true change that we want to see too, like it's only going to come when we bring together the power of diverse perspectives, backgrounds, identities, you know, coming together and coming up with these innovative solutions that are really going to tackle and not shy away from the real barriers and biases and challenges to equity and inclusion and flexibility and all the things we're going to be talking about for all. And so, you know, as we spend the next few days thinking about how we can all bring, you know, our humanity to work, like what this really means for me is it comes down to people and their experiences, and that really being at the heart and, you know, just at the center of everything we do. And so really excited to explore more about this today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Andrea and the Bridgeable team to get our learning journey started.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I appreciate that intro. And so we are sharing with you the title of our session. We hope you have found yourself in the correct session on the agenda for the conference today. But before we really dive into everything, I'd just like to explain our goals. So over the next hour, we're going to introduce you to the human-centered design process. We'll try to do this justice. I know you've probably heard it in different ways, but at Bridgeable, we like to try to simplify that for any newbies in the room. We're going to help you understand applying human-centered design through a case study that we've executed actually last year, mid-pandemic. And so we hope that that gives you some inspiration on how to do human-centered design virtually. And then we're also going to ideally inspire you to leverage human-centered design to build more equitable workplaces. We're going to provide some prompts and some work for everyone to do in this session. And then the way that Stephanie framed it, for tomorrow, we're actually going to have you in working teams working through a challenge statement as well. So today is the primer and the education piece. Tomorrow is a lot more of the doing. And thank you for joining us. Like I probably already said when you were joining, my name is Andrea Girton. I'm the Vice President of Design Strategy at Bridgeable. And today I am joined by my colleague.
Hi, I'm your Donna Soldemariam. I'm a senior design researcher at Bridgeable and very excited to be here with you all today.
And so if you're not familiar with us, Bridgeable is an award-winning human-centered design consultancy. We work with leaders, organizations, and people to design better customer experience and translate strategic into action. Together, we're creating a more human world. And when we talk about human-centered design, we want to think about how you can actually bring diverse skill sets and perspectives together. And that's also why we don't really fit in a box around human-centered design. You'll hear us talk about research, you'll hear us talk about design, you'll hear us talk about change management and implementation around management consulting. And so really thinking about those diverse perspectives, that's when we're strongest, when we bring those different experiences together. And the types of problems that human-centered design can solve, many complex, overly onerous and wild and crunchy problems. You hear us talk about lots of those, but really here are a couple of examples of what we've done. So when we talk about that, you might have heard the how might we statement. We like to talk about how can we. So how can we design public spaces that make people feel safe to come back post-pandemic? How can we design an MRI machine for children that reduces their anxiety? How can we understand and map the support processes and policies that help us serve our employees? And how can we redesign the experience of opening a bank account to be more customer friendly? So you can see that human-centered design as a method is really helping across different types of industries and challenges.
Great, thanks Andrea for the intro. So we're just going to share with you tomorrow's challenge question. So again, this is a how might we statement and what we'd like to explore with you today as we go through our session, and then as well with our interactive portion tomorrow is how might employers provide more structured flexibility to employees in our new post-pandemic reality. So we'll leave that there to kind of sit with you for a bit, and we'll jump into a warm-up activity. I know there's lots of us here today, but we're hoping you get a chance to get to know each other a little bit. Again, Andrea mentioned, if you don't mind turning on your camera while we're in the warm-up, that'll be great, just so it's a little more personable. All right, so we're gonna get our brains warmed up. I'll give you a bit of a rundown of what our warm-up will be for today. So you'll be paired up in breakout rooms. So you'll get a pop-up box, and I'm sure everyone's familiar. Just click on the join button and you'll find your match. The question we're asking you to consider today is, has there ever been a time when a new policy was rolled out and you wished you had been consulted? So this might sound like a bit of a silly question, but this is the core of what human-centered design really is. So we're trying to prioritize the right amount of time and activities that we need to use in order to gather the right perspectives, understand these diverse experiences, and bring all those to the table as we continue to design our ideas and solutions and put them into action. So you'll have 3 minutes in your breakout rooms to discuss this question. Think about your own experiences, think about the experiences of those around you. Think big, think small, and we'll bring you back in 3 minutes to share some of your ideas. And we'll drop the question in the chat just in case you need it as a prompt as well. I will cue the breakout rooms, so we'll give that a moment.
Apologies, I'm just running into some technical difficulties. Give me 2 minutes. Thank you so much.
We see you floating away into your breakout rooms. Well, we'll set the timer once everyone is into those rooms, and then we'll see.
I can't tell if I'm in a room yet.
That's my exact thought as well.
Yeah, me too. I'm not sure if I'm still in the main room. I don't see a join button or anything.
No.
Did anything pop up at the bottom right-hand corner?
Same here.
No,
I didn't hit
No.
join.
No, I don't see anything.
You got this.
Apologies, y'all. I'm just going to close the breakout rooms. I had opened them, so just give me about 30 seconds. So sorry about this inconvenience. Technology, it happens.
All the time.
Thank you for your patience with this, and we should figure it out shortly.
No worries. Manulife GWA, North America, we just ran a virtual conference all of last week. So I get you. I get your pain.
Thank you.
I've had nothing but trouble with Zoom breakout groups lately.
That's so unfortunate to hear. I think what we're doing is we're getting some people into there. But, you know, we could also just benefit from having this conversation openly. That this was to get people to not be intimidated by the virtual version of this, but we could turn this into a big global event session. I'm sure there have been policies that have been rolled out that you wish you had been consulted on. Does anyone have one they would like to openly talk about?
Yes, this is Jenny. So the policy that was rolled out was we had, this was one of my previous employers, we suddenly were in a staff meeting and it was suddenly announced that the service provider, our health insurance provider, was going to be changed, and you know, a new one was coming on board on such and such a date. And I don't think the leadership were really prepared for the reaction. There was no overt reaction, of course. Everyone was very sort of, you know, calm in their demeanor, but you could tell from the facial expressions. And then one person did actually speak up and say it would have been nice if there'd been some consultation. There are some specific provisions in our existing healthcare plan that benefits my partner. I now have no idea if those are also available in the new insurance policy. So it was just interesting to sort of watch that play out for sure.
Jenny, thank you for the courage to speak and share with everybody. I think that that's also what organizations are kind of looking for, is for people to have the courage to speak out, but that puts you on, you're kind of spotlighted, right? And advocating for having gotten feedback and being heard. That's when we're talking about human-centered design is not this magic mystical thing. I mean, we like to think that we're experts in running this process so we can figure out how to mitigate some of those risks, but it's really like carving out much needed time to get feedback and perspectives. People forget that everyone else's lives don't look like their own. And so I can appreciate that changing the insurance providers was a big rollout that could have had more consultation.
Well, Jenny, thank you for sharing that example. Is there anyone else who wants to share? Even feel free to jump in the chat box if you want to share any comments, and any ways that you, even if you haven't experienced it, but ways that you think even Jenny's example might have been handled differently.
Hi, this is Kevin.
Steve.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'll be quick. So I won't give a specific policy change, but what I found with previous policy changes, having that conversation with your manager, who also, you know, can reiterate, you know, the concerns and needs of the team to senior managers. You know, it might not be direct, but indirectly you're influencing, you know, maybe the conversation at the table way above you.
It's a good point. And when you're thinking about if you are the kind of the proxy for people's opinions, and the proxy for that feedback, and thinking about how does that now indirect feedback, how has that been muddied, or how has that been differently explained than it was explained to them. This is a very complex way to try to get feedback, but it happens all the time, and it shouldn't be overlooked as at least something in that communication chain. It's a good example as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull out Kate's example in the chat as well, just talking about looping back and circling back when you're getting input and getting consultation, just so that when we're gathering feedback, it's such an important piece to make sure we're using it and letting people who are willing to share some of that feedback know how it's being actioned. So a really, really important piece around consulting and gathering that feedback as well. All right. So lots of really great stuff in the chat. I think we're going to move our warm-up activity along and jump into an introduction to human-centered design. So we're going to give you an overview of the design process and share with you some general overarching things to think about when you're implementing human-centered design. All right. So organizations often focus on delivering the functional aspects of their products and services and don't always step back to actively design for the whole human experience. So what this means, or what we're saying here, is that often companies are focused on trying to solve more discrete problems and challenges, and they're not necessarily focused on the customer's overall well-being. And I know I say customer here, but when we're talking about human-centered design, we are also talking about employees, agencies, partners, and a number of different stakeholders. And it's all these experiences combined that we really need to look at when we're designing for the whole human experience as well. All right, so what is human-centered design? So human-centered design is a process for finding solutions to complex problems and really understanding the people who are involved and engaging with them every step of the way. So a way that we can talk and think about this and do this is by talking about the three forces of innovation. So whenever we look at solving a problem or creating a product or service, there are three forces that we talk about when we're trying to innovate. And those are desirability, feasibility, and viability. So organizations tend to often focus in more on the functional aspects and products and services, as I mentioned. So this usually ends up looking like a focus on the feasibility and viability of some of these products and services. So what we're really pointing to here when we talk about human-centered design is to also focus on this desirability piece. So what is it that people actually need? And how can we focus a little bit less on the feasibility and viability and really bring these three together to design for the whole human experience. So using human-centered design, again, is one way for us to bring the focus on this question of desirability and understanding what it is that people actually need and what experiences, what these experiences should look like. So by understanding human-centered design, we're able to kind of take some really complex or problems that are not really clearly defined and understand who the people are that are involved, and then we can, create a whole holistic experience around that. So.
If it feels like there's a significant tension around this Venn diagram, there should be, and there is always, and we'll talk about that in our case as well. People that want to solidify the business case or the feasibility of implementation and looking around the desirability. It's a good tension when you think about prioritizing what to do first.
Great, and so that was a great way for us to preface and really frame our minds around how we should think and talk about the design process. I'm going to walk us through the steps. So some of you might already be familiar with the design process, but the first stage is discover. So here's where we're really looking to engage and empathize with individuals and learn as much as possible around the context and the experiences and what's important to them. And again, this is such an important piece to make sure that we're really understanding the lay of the land before we identify or pinpoint a specific problem or challenge that we'd like to address. And the second stage in the design process is define. So this is where we take that research and we consolidate it and synthesize it. We can find out what the emerging themes are and frame different opportunities that we can address. So again, these first two stages are just really important when we're addressing a problem, just to make sure that we have all the information that we need ahead of jumping in and making sure that we're addressing the right challenges. Because oftentimes we can come into a space, and if we have our own personal view or lens on something, we might have an idea of what a challenge might be, but we really do need to spend some time doing our homework to make sure we're addressing the right problems and talking to the right people. And then our third stage here in the design process is design. So I think that's the most exciting part usually, but this is where we're collaborating and co-creating and prototyping. So we're really engaging with different stakeholders and bringing them along the entire journey. So an important piece of the human-centered design process is just that we're continuing to include all the different stakeholders as we walk along that journey. And then next we have the testing phase. So testing is where we re-engage and make sure again that we're bringing our ideas and solutions and the different things that we have co-created and refining them a bit more. So talking to the right people, figuring out who we need to talk to, what the questions are that we need to ask in order to really improve our solutions ahead of implementation. And then our last but not least is do, and this is where we're implementing and planning. So there's a number of different steps that need to be taken when we're actioning and operationalizing some of our solutions and prototypes, a lot of constraints that need to be considered, and a lot of people that you do need to bring to the table when moving into this last phase of the design process. All right, so no matter what problem we're solving, people are at the center. So we just want to overemphasize that when we say human-centered design, what we're talking about is including the person across all steps of the design process. So sometimes it's easy to want to just pull in certain perspectives at one point in a project phase. And I understand that sometimes there's different constraints and feasibility can be a challenge, but what we're really trying to encourage when we talk about human-centered design and addressing these more complex challenges is to really be intentional about including individual perspectives as we move through each phase in the design process. And I will tag Andrea in just to final note, just to say that human-centered design is something we really don't want to do in isolation and really work together to do.
Thank you. And so why we're focusing on test and do today is because it's typically where the design process falls off or human-centered design falls off. It's where people start to think about implementation is just getting whatever we initially designed out the door, getting it rolled out, getting it shared or socialized with everyone. But we'd like to share with you how you can actually continue to test and garner feedback and ask different stakeholders their opinions on how something might be successful all the way into the do phase around implementation. Now, there are two words that we're going to use a lot, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. You might be familiar with the design process. You might have also heard it as the double diamond. And so you'll see that it shows discover, define, design, and test. And you see those arrows at the top where we talk about divergent and convergent thinking. So really all you want to think about is divergent thinking is how big of an aperture or a lens or like a bucket of opinion and ideas can you kind of keep open for long enough to then converge and focus on the next way forward, or confidence and finding that confidence to move forward. And so the design process, you'll see, we're always kind of doing this ebb and flow between diverging and converging on feedback, on opinions, on the ideas, on the scale. All of that allows for a lot of nimble kind of risk mitigation in this process. And now, further ado, this is our case study. So in the pandemic, Bridgeable partnered with Prosper Canada. And Prosper Canada had a challenge. They wanted to help deliver remote delivery of tax filing and benefits application support to financially insecure Canadians. But the challenge that exists with is that a lot of the people that need to be able to access those benefits haven't actually done the mechanisms to be able to apply for or qualify for that type of support. And so when we think about the types of systems that keep benefits from the people that they were intended for, this is a really good human-centered design problem because it makes sense. It needs to be actioned. But if we think about all of the challenges surrounding it, the stakeholders and the people involved, it starts to get really, really big. And it's not unfamiliar when you're thinking about running human-centered design or even trying to tackle different challenges in a large, complex organization. It's similar and saying, we need to do this very obvious thing. But here we're running up against roadblocks or challenges or constantly evolving mandates, just like it happened with COVID-19. And so when we're trying to think about who we helped, we didn't go to the financially insecure Canadians. We actually worked with the FECs. And so the FECs are the Financial Empowerment Champions. They are all of these different organizations that are responsible for helping the financially insecure Canadians get this type of aid and benefit. And so we used them as multiple stakeholder groups to get their feedback and input on what could help them enable this access to these benefits. And we've given you a little bit of a snapshot around our project approach. And you'll see if it's big enough, and I'm hoping it is now that I'm looking at it. For our research phase, we kicked off with research. And then what we did was we engaged our FECs, we ideated, we built it out, we validated, we built it out, we validated, we finalized, then we shared back. Every single one of these steps gets feedback and validation and breaking and testing in this to make sure that we're getting enough of these stakeholders' opinions, guidance, and recommendations so that our idea can be as sticky or as adopted as possible. Now, there's a funny twist on this. Sometimes what happens when Bridgeable is brought into different organizations to do this type of work, the company has already run some sort of research phase or survey or data gathering that is kind of the research phase already completed. And while that's not ideal for us, it happens all the time and it's totally okay. It's kind of like looking around a quantitative survey or potentially feedback or comments and synthesizing that into where are our opportunities to focus in our types of efforts in this type of approach. And so if you've run an open-ended survey, it is not wrong to have done that. But what you want to do is think about what is it uncovering so that you can go learn more. It is never the final step in this type of a process. And so when we did that synthesis around those surveys, we found that there were 3 key themes for these FECs. They're shifting priorities to serve immediate needs of their clients. Many of the types of services that were relied on had some sort of in-person interaction, for example, ID verification, which was now overly complicated because of physical distancing recommendations. And also the remote delivery of services is challenging because of privacy regulations, people's access to technology, barriers around the type of support and even connectedness to a cell phone for these different types of users. And so these are big themes that we got out of the survey. And so once again, we've kind of diverged to find those themes. We've kind of converged to figure out what are those buckets and concerns that we need to be advocating for. But then in the far right corner, or at least the corner of the slide, you'll see that we actually then sat down and talked about viability, feasibility, and desirability to help us think about the short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals and how we might actually tackle them. So I think it was Lena wrote it in the comments where you're saying, how do you actually make sure that an organization doesn't only worry about feasibility and viability in considering this? Sometimes what you can do is when you break this into steps or phases of action, you can usually try to get desirability in if you don't make something one big massive opportunity, but you can actually kind of phase it. It allows different types of stakeholders and people to feel heard and appreciated in terms of whatever they own in that process. Now, we took those themes and then we needed to define different opportunities in those themes. And what you want to do when you're thinking about opportunities for human-centered design, you actually want to create sub-challenges. So we parsed this down into what are the actual small interactions that people are experiencing that we want to uncover and get better feedback on. And so we built sub-challenge statements to focus that ideation, because when you tell someone, go solve something, and you give them very few constraints, it can be very hard for someone to be successful. So what we did was we led them through virtual facilitation, and we asked, how can we help clients identify and locate the documents? How can we help them share and file paperwork together? And how can we help clients submit their returns and applications? We also facilitated this through live group discussion and some ideation so that it accommodated people that could be what you might hear is asynchronous work time. So some people's schedules and calendars, when we're talking about COVID, don't allow for a certain availability. And so we want to be able to run some of these ideation and gathering sessions at different times of day or in different methods. So we're making sure that we're considering people in the way that they can be present and can engage with these types of sessions. Now we think about the validation that we had in the past discussions. We took that feedback and we built out scenarios based on some of those approaches in order to get some feedback. And what we started to see was that we needed to show what are those barriers to access. And because we're doing this virtually, it's really hard to have this conversation just didactically where we're saying, this is what we hear. This is my long-winded narrative around what we're trying to show. And so we actually built scenarios through illustrations, or you might actually hear about these called storyboards. And so we're trying to get people to speak to a visual that allows them to be in the moment of that interaction to give better and more nuanced feedback on that approach. And you might hear this, that say-do kind of triangle when you're getting really good feedback from participants or customers or clients or employees. You want to figure out how can you create a mechanism for someone to make sure that it doesn't feel overly polished so that there is a chance for them to give that feedback, but then also try to get them to really share what happens in that moment of interaction. It's the same idea when you think about something like Noom that uses behavioral economics as a diet app. It asks you how many salads you had last week, and you might casually say 4. But then if you're tracking it, you might look back and you realize that you didn't have any last week. And that can also be what happens in these validation sessions. People can be overly complimentary, or they forget the most complicated part of a process. And so you want to think, how can you actually uncover that level of emotion, even when you're thinking about a virtual validation? And so this is another example around how are we talking through validation. Given those evolving COVID-19 measures, it was the regulations, the guidelines, and having all of these ideas needed to make sure that they suited very different types of paths. And so through that validation, we kind of realized from everyone that was sharing their feedback with us that there would be no one-size-fits-all solution. That this was very nuanced, and it had to be nuanced for it to be adopted or work for anyone. And that again is another really complicated conversation that needs to happen in some of these design challenges. People will focus on trying to have a standardized or a one-size-fits-all approach for something. And many times, if it's trying to help everyone at one time, it might actually not be helping anyone. And so there are a lot of good things around the viability of an idea to justify trying to think about paths or journeys for specific types of people. You might be familiar with personas, and personas is one mechanism that tries to help people understand the nuanced view of other different types of journeys for one type of solution. Now we got that feedback and we learned that there was not one type of solution for everyone, but we remembered that there was those 4 themes to help give the FECs access to financially insecure Canadians. And so we took those 4 themes and then we took those 25 ideas and we actually created a menu. And so we're trying to organize and provide logic around these types of paths so that we could think about what are the tools, what are the steps, and what is the information that can help anyone that might be experiencing one of these types of paths. So for example, if you see here, the 4 challenges remain the same, but then the kind of like the lever or the logic flow changes. So for example, if you're trying to communicate with the client and you're an FEC and they have a phone, you might use an audio call or a text message because they didn't have internet access. Or if they live far away and can't leave home, maybe there's a way that you can send a checklist via mail. You're thinking about people and trying to meet them with where they're able to access your idea And so sharing a menu like this allowed us to make sure that we weren't missing any steps or function. And so the stakeholders as the FECs that we validated with this round are the people that gave us further detail and nuance on what we needed to include in these packages of directions for others to execute. And so through this work and these validation sessions and this gathering, we were able to create these kind of implementation packets. These were packets that allowed people to understand every step of that menu process or the reality with which they might engage with financially insecure Canadians. But there's something we'd like to really highlight here. A lot of the time when we're working on this type of work, the implementation falls to people that weren't a part of the validation or the conversations before then. And so is there any way that you might be able to bring people in to talk about how it needs to be communicated or accessed? And if that's not possible, I would really encourage you to think about what is the most simple, concise, and easily accessible way that you can actually convey these interactions that aren't just potentially words or written. Are there illustrations to allow people to have access or to understand? Are there flows just like storyboards to communicate that information? Is there an audio or video component that can be considered? When we talk about equity and access, we're talking about not just gathering those voices, but we're also thinking about the formats and mediums that allow people to better understand and be successful when we're thinking about adoption or sharing and education around some of these crunchy ideas. And so for us, that's when we think about impact for human-centered design. We had this really crunchy problem, and at every step of the road, what we did was we engaged with the FECs, we engaged with some of the Canadians that were impacted by these challenges to get their feedback. We engaged the survey, but most often what we did was we took something that started to get really divergent, and we figured out how to break it apart into smaller, simpler ways to get really deeper understanding, and then converged on ways forward, and then asked for a little bit of growth and then for it to converge again. Now, the idea of this happening and breaking wide open at the end of a project can be really daunting and scary, and not a risk that a lot of people want to lean into. But my challenge to you on that is, wouldn't it be nice to know that it's not the right idea before it gets implemented? It's much easier to start fresh or to find the ways to figure something out versus just pretending that everything is fine without getting that feedback in the first place. And so as we share this idea and this case with you around the impacts of COVID-19 and financial security, we'd really like for you to consider, how can you get more voices? How can you get that feedback dynamically? And how can you really take very complex stakeholder relationships and problems and break them out into more smaller, actionable chunks? And now it is your turn. And we potentially are going to hope and cross our fingers that this breakout will happen, because we would love to have people sharing the discussion and the feedback from the case on this. And if not, we'll do another big group discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Andrea. So we do hope that this case study has inspired you to really start thinking about how you can break apart some of these things that we're looking to implement, especially when the landscape has changed so much with the pandemic and the complexities of people's experiences, and access to different resources has changed. So a big piece that we really do need to think about is how we can address some of these challenges. And human-centered design does offer us an avenue. And again, it's not the magic wand, as Andrea said earlier, to solving all our problems, but it is a way for us to really hold ourselves accountable to make sure that we are including individuals with diverse backgrounds and diverse access to resources as we address some of these bigger problems. So that being said, we do have a question here that we'd like to hopefully break you out to chat about. But we'd like to ask, if you're working on something currently that needs to be adopted by a diverse set of stakeholders, and this could be currently, if you're not currently working on something like this, maybe if you have worked on something in the past and could reflect a little bit on how you may have done that differently. We're hoping today's case study inspires you a bit to really think outside the box and think big in terms of how you could address making sure adoption can be successful, and what mechanisms of action that you might use. So whether it is some of the examples Andrea shared around around storyboarding and visualizing things differently, and really trying to spread a message to as many different people in as many different circumstances as possible. So we'll break you out into your breakouts in a moment, and then we'll have you come back again and share some of your thoughts. So fingers crossed we can.
It looks like it's happening this time. We're all good.
Great. Okay.
We'll see you in 5 minutes.
All right, so we'd like to spend the next few minutes getting some of your feedback. So feel free to share some of your conversation in the chat, or turn on your microphone and you can share some of your conversations. If anyone has a specific example that they were talking about in their breakout room and would like to share, we'd love to hear it. So we'll give you a moment to share back.
Since everyone is being shy, I'll take the lead and go first.
All right, thanks, Claire.
I was actually paired with someone from my company, interestingly enough. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for like using the tools as it relates to like the storyboarding, the brainstorming, using some of those tactics, but it always comes back to understanding each of the various stakeholder needs.
Right.
And then it always comes back to time to do that. Because in theory, you know, this is great, but I always start to think about, okay, how do we operationalize and execute some of the things that we are looking to do from a project perspective when it's always fast to take to market. So just food for thought. So that's what I'll share.
Yeah, no, certainly, Claire. And I think that's what we're also hoping to accomplish tomorrow during our simulation, is really giving you a real world example of where, you know, you're not necessarily having all the resources to walk through the entire design process, but seeing how we can use some of the things that we've shared today to really try to implement smaller pieces when testing something. So if it is something like a policy, or if it is something that you're really hoping gets adopted by a group of stakeholders quickly, like, can we take a pause? Can we do some of these things in between to ask the right questions and get the right people at the table to make some changes ahead of rolling out new solutions or whatever the thing might be. But thank you for sharing that, Claire. I'll pause and see if there's anyone else who would like to share one more thought.
Hi, Dana. So I was in a group with Fatimata, and I was just relaying to her the story of relaunching our diversity census within my organization. And I think the last one had been done over 10 years ago.
Right.
So when I was tasked with the project, I went first of all to our ERGs and just got some insight, got some feedback on how the last process had gone. And it was funny, just through that feedback, I was able to just tailor my approach, you know, not take a much more objective approach by consulting external subject matter experts. But even while I was doing that, the whole time I was keeping it very iterative. So really making sure that some of the feedback that had been given around, you know, language accessibility, perhaps feeling othered, all that type of thing. So just kept the whole thing very iterative.
Yeah.
And so what's really nice to hear, just with some preliminary results, is that more than half to 2/3, there's been a response rate, which, you know, for employee surveys can be very challenging to get a high rate. So yeah, it was really pleasing to hear that.
Yeah, what do you think, if you don't mind just sharing a couple nuggets on it, Jenny, that made that the most successful? Because I know there's a lot of talks around the constraints and timing and resources. Is there anything around that experience you feel made it different?
Oh, absolutely. So the first thing I did was, once I was given the task, the first thing I did was talk to the ERGs. You know, everything that Catalyst has shared so far through their speakers and their panels about the power and value and benefits to organizations around ERGs is something that I totally concur with, just based on my personal experience. So I went to the ERGs, talked to them about the census, really got a good temperature check from them, particularly as a virtual new hire. So I've never been in my organization yet in person. So this is all virtual, so incredibly helpful. So just going to a trusted source for, that type of feedback. So that's the first thing. And then I have to say, the second thing is just something that's been a bit of a blessing, where I'm just very lucky with the professional network that I have. So being able to reach out to various organizations that focus on one particular diversity dimension and getting their help as well, just based on relationships. So it wasn't even it wasn't a transactional kind of service arrangement. It was literally a couple of questions, 15-minute virtual coffee, would really appreciate your help, and got that help. So that was the networking and the relationship piece as well.
Amazing. I think that's so incredible to just, figure out how you can really build those and leverage those relationships to do some of the things we're talking about without having to make it too much of an onerous lift. We are nearing time, but thank you so much, Jenny, for sharing that. Just want to give you a highlight into what we're going to do tomorrow. We have planned for you, and we really hope that we see all of you again, because it'll be a nice follow-up to the conversation so far. So today we showed you different tactics around breaking down some of these bigger problems into smaller chunks using the human-centered design process with that focus on the test and learn phase. Tomorrow we're gonna bring back our challenge question. So how might employers provide more structured flexibility to employees in our new post-pandemic reality? And you'll get to collaborate on a scenario question. So hopefully this will answer a lot of the questions that came up in the chat today and in conversations, I imagine, in your breakout rooms as well, on how we can, without making things overly onerous, but implement some of these techniques to really have greater impact, include as many perspectives and experiences as possible. And we'll share one quote for you as well, just to kind of give you food for thought. So our needs and experiences of what it means to be human are different based on how we look, where we are born, how we are treated, and how we move through the world. So I challenge you to really think about today how you came to the session, how you spoke around some of these challenges, and whether you felt that was truly from your own personal lens, if you were able to adopt a bit of a broader lens, or at least think about what pieces might be missing when you are thinking about these problems and challenge areas. So again, I'm really looking forward to having most or all of you back tomorrow so we can dig a little bit deeper, but a little food for thought. And we hope that you enjoyed today's session. And I'll hand it off to Andrea for any final words.
I'm going to stop sharing and just say thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for being willing to be on video, to go with the flow on some tech, getting the first breakout, and good luck with absorbing all of the messages in the other sessions for the remainder of today. Thank you very much for joining us.